It's an honor and a privilege to be able to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Katherine Spielmann has been an important influence on my career and has done a remarkable amount of really high quality research and teaching. And we'll get just a little taste of her abilities as a lecturer today. She has degrees from Harvard and the University of Michigan. She taught at the University of Iowa for several years, and then since 1987 she's been at Arizona State University, where she's professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change. Her research interests focus on prehistoric economies, basically economies in small-scale societies, largely in North America, and especially she's been interested in elucidating the variety of conditions under which small-scale societies with relatively non-complex political systems develop complex and specialized economies. Early in her career, she focused on interaction between settled Pueblo farmers and nomadic hunter-gatherers from the southern plains, and more generally on the development of ecological models explaining interaction among small-scale societies. More recently, she's been focused on the ways in which ritual and social contexts fuel the demand for goods and food and lead to economic intensification. She's conducted 20 years of archaeological field research in the Salinas area of central New Mexico, focusing there on a couple of issues. One is the nature and extent of economic specialization among aggregated Pueblo communities there. Also, she's investigated the impact of the Spanish colonization on the Pueblo people. In addition to analysis of data from the Salinas area research, she's currently involved in several other major research projects. One funded by the National Science Foundation involves studying the legacy of prehistoric and modern land use in Agua Fria National Monument north of Phoenix. Another project she's been involved in, again funded by the National Science Foundation, deals with developing a cyber infrastructure for archaeology and integrating databases from many projects so that we can conduct synthetic studies in a much more efficient and better way than we have. She's also, as an outgrowth of her study of craft specialization in the Salinas area, she's involved in a new research project to investigate craft specialization in other small-scale societies, including the Hopewell of Southern Ohio. And I think this is what we'll hear about today. In addition to all this research, she's chaired the committees of 9 PhD students, including me, and about twice that many MA students. I'm very pleased to be able to say that she's a mentor and a friend, and turn the time over to Dr. Kate Spielmann.
Hey, thank you, Jim, for that introduction. Thank you, Dr. Johnson and the faculty for inviting me to be the Shallit speaker this year, and thank you all for attending. I'm going to get this presentation going. We think. There we go. Okay, what I'll be doing this afternoon, I'll go back and forth between reading. I have the written paper here, and that will keep me focused and keep us going along in a logical fashion. But I'll also be speaking to this slide, so I'll sort of be going back and forth between text and slide. And what we'll be talking about today is crafting the sacred, ritual places and paraphernalia in small-scale societies. And what I'm interested in is not simply the objects. I've been focusing on the objects in previous research, but now I'm interested more in who is crafting, how is production both of place and of object organized, and that's what today's talk will be about. And as Dr. Johnson mentioned, there's a question and answer period at the end, so you're more than welcome. I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have. The global archaeological record of small-scale societies, and by those I mean about 100 to several thousand people, is replete with times and places where people expended considerable labor to craft places and objects for communal rituals. Those places that remain visible today are impressive and often the focus of public parks and monuments, while the enchanting objects fill museum cases. Generations of archaeologists have grappled with understanding the rationales responsible for this massive productive effort. In this paper, I approach the issue of ritual production with an interest in understanding the sociality of the organization of production. I reference ethnographic data concerning the production of ritual places and objects in small-scale societies, and archaeological analyses of more complex societies to suggest scenarios or hypotheses that elucidate the patterning in the archaeological record of ritual production. Together, these data suggest that much, though not all, ritual production can be understood in terms of corporate agency. Such production encompassed a web of complementary relations that would have resulted in all adults participating in the materialization of ideology many times in their lives. There are power questers or aggrandizers in this record, but they do not dominate it. I take as my focus two examples of elaborate, large-scale communal ritual spaces and crafts: the early British Neolithic causewayed enclosures and the Ohio Hopewell geometric earthworks. They share certain commonalities in organization of production, but also important elements of difference, and so we'll explore both the commonalities and the difference. In both cases, formal communal ritual places were created by peoples whose settlements were small, dispersed, and short-lived. British Neolithic pastoralist and Ohio Hopewell farmer hunter-gatherer habitations are notoriously difficult to find. So what we have are the monuments, but we don't often have the residences. The only archaeological visible places, areas of aggregation, are the large earthworks these populations created. People convened periodically in and around earthworks, and you'll see lots of them in a minute, for a variety of ceremonial activities, including crafting, mortuary rituals, and ritualized deposition. Following a very brief introduction to each area, I then move on to an analysis of similarities and differences in the production of place and of esoteric objects. The building of causewayed enclosures was one of the most widespread practices in all of early Neolithic Europe, and the term causewayed, they're also referred to as segmented enclosures. Here we go. Causewayed refers to the fact that the ditches are interrupted. So each of these is a ditch, and the causeway is the earth, the passageway in between these ditches. At least 50 causewayed enclosures have been documented in Britain alone. Although the details of their construction vary, the general template is the excavation of deep, segmented ditches and a concomitant creation of a series of ringed embankments, with 1 to 3 rings per site. The ditches then become loci of ritual deposits, often containing burials, as well as deliberate deposits of cattle, often skulls, flint, and other material goods. A diversity of activities beyond strictly mortuary took place inside the rings, and with some exceptions, there's clear evidence of habitation at these sites, so they're sort of multi-use, although they're generally interpreted as foci of periodic communal ritual. The largest known causewayed enclosure is Windmill Hill in the Avebury district of Britain, southern Britain, whose ditches reached a maximum of about 3 meters with an average of about 2.5. Ditch banks were reveted, means they were put along the side, wooden posts were put along the side to keep the dirt from collapsing back in. The embankments enclosed 20 acres in 3 concentric circles, ditches and banks, representing a massive amount of labor over an unknown period of time, probably about 100 years or so. Whittle estimates that it took 62,000 to 64,000 person-hours to construct the ditches, not including the recutting of those ditches over the course of the life of the enclosure. So it's common for, once an enclosure is created, and we'll come back to this toward the end of the lecture, people will recut. So they'll fill in the ditches and then they'll recut them. The act of creating place is a constant activity across these landscapes. There are much smaller causewayed enclosures, such as the one at Abington near Oxford, which is only a couple of acres in size. So we have scale of about 2 acres to about 20 acres for causewayed enclosures. Inside the earthworks, excavations have recovered a variety of polished axes, flint knapping debris, local and non-local ceramics, and large quantities of animal bone, particularly cattle, which is generally interpreted as feasting debris. There are also many pits, both in the ditches and in the enclosed areas, which contain a number of special items that appear to have been offerings, such as deer antlers, axes, and fossils. Mercer interprets these enclosures in part as places for the exposure of bodies, human bodies, necropoli, that are then given a secondary burial, either there or in chambered tombs that are near some of the enclosures. As the embankments decayed into the ditches, occasional deposits of human bone and cultural materials were placed in the fill. One of the most widespread social valuables produced and circulated during the Neolithic are ground stone axes. Bradley and Edmonds note that some causewayed enclosures have produced unusually high concentrations of axes, as well as decorated pottery and other exotics. Axes are also frequently found as offerings in pits just outside the earthworks. Julian Thomas notes that the axe represents a, quote, singularly potent symbol throughout the Neolithic. So axes are a critical symbol, and I'll return to their production a little bit later in the lecture. Okay, turning to a brief introduction of Ohio Hopewell. From roughly 81 to 450, populations living in southern Ohio constructed at least 40 geometric earthworks, largely circles and squares, with occasional octagons and linear tracks. These are distributed along 3 drainage systems in southern Ohio: the Miami, the Scioto, and the Muskingum. And the fact that we have 3 different drainages involved, you'll see that there are different practices, different ways of creating place across these 3 drainages. The largest number of the earthwork enclosures are in the Scioto and tributaries near Chillicothe, Ohio. So in this map, you've got Chillicothe here. Here's the Scioto River. So this is really the heartland of Ohio Hopewell. And each of these little diagrams here shows you the location of a geometric earthwork. So they're quite concentrated in space. As Bernardini notes, the scale of these constructions is immense, with individual geometric shapes enclosing areas of 30 acres or more, although more commonly individual shapes enclose between 20 and 30 acres, similar to the scale of Windmill Hill. Earthen embankments range from a meter or so to as high as 3 or 4 meters high. Activities within these enclosures were diverse. Archaeological data document production, so the production of ornaments, textiles, and obsidian spears in some of them. Mortuary activities involving cremation and the curation of the cremains in charnel houses. People constructed mounds, quite a number of different kinds of mounds for a variety of purposes, including to cover decommissioned charnel houses. So this is a charnel house is a place where cremations are kept once the cremation has been created. So you essentially curate people in this structure until such time as it's time to end that. Perhaps the death of a particularly prominent person causes the end of the use of the charnel house. It's dismantled, so this is the house here, this tripartite structure, and then what this represents is a mound that is put over the dismantled charnel house. So one of the things I'm trying to get at here is that these earthworks don't contain the same kinds of activity. There isn't just a ritual, the same ritual in each one. Different activities in different ones, some of them involving charnel houses. Some mounds enclose, this mound, which you can see in the background, covers a charnel house much like the one that I just showed you. So this is a mound covering a charnel house. So some earthworks contain mounds, and some, such as Hopeton, this is right across from a site that contains a lot of mounds, contain almost no mounds. And so we think there may be some pairing between earthworks that contain mounds, that contain the mortuary activity, and earthworks that do not. Bernardini has focused on the labor necessary to construct some of the larger tripartite earthworks, such as this one. This is Sipe. His estimates for the completed tripartites approach 500,000 person hours, about 8 times that for the Windmill Hill causewayed enclosure. Now, analyses of labor are hampered by insufficient control over the dating and duration of each construction episode. But his analysis suggests that if earthwork construction were extended over 5 or 10 years, so sort of within a reasonable period of time, several hundred people per year would have participated in the construction. And we'll come back to that figure, several hundred people, in a little bit. Given the concentrations of earthworks in various portions of southern Ohio, the fact that they're clustered, people were likely involved in the construction of several earthworks during their lifetime. So this isn't the case where you have a community and an earthwork. People were involved in constructing many earthworks during their life. Okay, so before we launch into an analysis of the creation of these places, it's important to look at some of the commonalities. These include similar historic antecedents. In both cases, before they started building earthworks, they were tombs, large-scale tombs that were constructed, megaliths in Britain and Adena mounds in Hopewell. The enormous labor involved. In both cases, more labor was put into creating earthworks than any other practice in either the Neolithic or the Ohio Hopewell. The association with mortuary ritual, the generations over which people constructed them. So in both cases, we're looking at about 400 to 500 years in which this ritual practice was accommodated. And the fact that they're segmented. In both cases, there's a great deal of variability in activities undertaken within the earthworks, and thus in both areas, people came to agree upon a syntax for monumentality. So a lot of people agreed on the way to construct monuments, but the place created was appropriate for diverse activities. Two primary differences between the two cases are scalar. Geographically, causewayed enclosures were constructed across much of northern Europe, so a huge swath of area. People created causewayed enclosures, whereas in Ohio Hopewell, it's just southern Ohio. In terms of labor, Ohio Hopewell earthworks are likely to have involved significantly more labor, so scalar, greater physical scale, to construct than causewayed enclosures. Now, in each of these cases, people came together to create formal ritual spaces that permanently transformed and structured the landscapes in which they had lived. Interestingly, these kinds of humanly constructed permanent transformations are not common in the ethnographic record of communal ritual action among small-scale societies. Instead, many of the spaces where such actions take place are unelaborated. They may be within habitation areas, such as the kraals within parts of Africa, or in areas cleared for the occasion, such as among the Tiwi of northern Australia. In these cases, labor is not involved in creating communal ritual space. Highly charged ritual landscapes may require no elaboration. For example, it is instructive to remember that in Australia, the entire landscape is a ritual one, the product of the dream time, and human elaboration would appear to be superfluous. So there are situations where the natural landscape is completely full of power and other sorts of things, no need to modify it. Among the Enga of Papua New Guinea, however, based on Polly Wiesner's research, clans and cults do make formal clearings for their ceremonial grounds, and I'm afraid I don't have a slide of that. They cut the grounds into hillsides and then devote a great deal of effort to level them. Some of these grounds measure over 10 acres. The enclosed space is thus within the range of causewayed enclosures, but smaller than the completed Hopewell earthwork complexes. Like the prehistoric populations discussed here in the historical past, the Enga were relatively sparsely distributed, shifting horticulturalist hunters. So, what makes it important to transform space, to create a physical intervention in the mythic fabric of the land? That's what Gillian Thomas calls it, or a new technology of the social. What makes it important to do that sort of thing? Why signal the increasing importance of place, create a new experience of space and a new context for social life? In addressing this question, a diversity of researchers highlight the importance of the built environment in communicating and reaffirming systems of meaning, such as relations between groups and the existence of community. If the social order is part of the cosmic order, and highly autonomous segments in small-scale societies are united through a shared cosmology, then the construction of massive communal places lends a concrete form to an amorphous moral community. Vernon Knight suggests that such concreteness represents a community effort to ensure intergenerational stability of a particular view of social reality. And Leonard and Boyer note that expensive rituals and actions, such as the building of these large earthen enclosures, are a public commitment to cohesion that is hard to fake. These points concern the proximate causes for the creation of communal monuments by small-scale societies. The ultimate causes behind concrete and intergenerational expressions of community are diverse, historically contingent, and beyond the scope of this discussion. Researchers, however, often refer to increasing regional or interregional competition at some scale. It's important to note, however, that in neither the early British Neolithic nor Ohio Hopewell cases is there a record of sustained or widespread conflict. So if there is concern about sort of the filling up of the landscape, that's not being expressed in hostilities at the times that I'm talking about here. So can we get further than simply acknowledging that there's a social reality involved in the creation of communal monuments to grapple with the nature of that social reality? In this essay, I argue that the style of the construction of these monuments provides important clues to the social units responsible for and affirmed by this practice. At both the Ohio Hopewell Earthworks, which is the tripartite site on the left, and British Neolithic causewayed enclosures, it is clear that social reality was segmented. Richard Bradley notes, in fact, that one element that unites causewayed enclosures is segmentation. Enclosure ditches were excavated by a number of work crews as they built sections of irregular width and depth. You can tell where one starts and another begins. The majority of the Ohio Hopewell earthworks are also segmented, and the segments are commonly of different sizes. That's something we'll come back to. So the following discussion addresses the relationship between the community created and expressed by large-scale monumental construction and the choice to manifest that community as segmented. So what we're going to do here is talk a little bit about two general concepts, microcosms and sociograms, and then I'm going to lead us through a series of archaeological and ethnographic examples where those concepts make sense. And by the end, we'll come back to Ohio Hopewell and the British Neolithic. I'll be using pieces of information from each of these cases to make an argument about those particular prehistoric records. Because there is a strong relationship between the built environment and relations between groups, it is not uncommon for central places to exhibit physical manifestations of the individual groups who created them. These constructs express the political and/or social segmentation of the community, and the resulting creation is referred to as a microcosm or sociogram of the community. The term microcosm refers to political centers, such as early state capitals, where political and territorial subunits express themselves in segments within the built environment. The term sociogram has been applied to smaller scale societies, where the subunits are corporate groups, kinship groups, who build mounds and houses and ceremonial centers. After elaborating somewhat more on these concepts, as I mentioned, then I use them to understand Ohio and British Neolithic enclosures. The identification of prehistoric microcosms has involved the analysis of links between the organization of public structures at centers and spatial units, or territories in the larger polity. For example, in the 1980s, Olivier de Montmollin built on previous analyses of Plaza hinterland relationships in Mesoamerica to propose that the concept of a political microcosm explained the physical configuration of the Mayan late classic center of Tenam Rosario in Chiapas, Mexico. Okay, so this is Tenam Rosario, and what de Montmollin was arguing is that through his survey, he had identified what he called two territorial components within the state, within this particular state. And he felt that these two fairly large plazas, each with its own ball court, were a physical manifestation, a physical representation in the center of that polity, of the existence of those territories. He further argued that these smaller plazas that were appended onto the big ones, so 2, 4, and 1 against 3, and 10, 7, 8 against 6, were subunits, sub-territories, which his archaeological survey had also identified. Now, in some Mesoamerican centers, basically you get essentially a confederation of different territorial units. What de Montmollin identified was an apical construction, two large plazas that happened to be up on an acropolis. You can't tell that from this map. And so his argument was that this particular set of plazas in the center of the center was a physical manifestation of the political centrality, of the hegemony of some political group over the entire state. So rather than being a confederacy of different sub-territories, it was a united polity. Okay, thus the territorial alignments were reproduced in microcosm within the capital civic and ceremonial zones. And in the case of Tenam Rosario, he makes the argument that the apical nature of plazas 5 and 9 suggests that the microcosm reproduces the subordinate status of territorial units in the face of a centralized political authority. More recently, Christian Wells has used the concept of a microcosm to analyze affiliations between residential patios at the center of La Quemada in the Malpaso Valley of Zacatecas, Mexico. So what we're looking at here is another state capital. So we looked at Tenam Rosario, that's a Mayan capital. Now we're up in northern Mexico at La Quemada. But it's the same sort of argument that there's a physical link between physical structures in the capital and the larger territory of the state surrounding the capital. So what Christian Wells did was a ceramic analysis of a series of middens from close to the core of the center. So the core is composed of a ball court, a columned hall, and some other really spectacular public monuments. So you have a series of residences close to that core, and you have a series of residences further away. And what he was able to demonstrate is the ones that are closest to the core are directly related to a particular territory that's part of that state. And so he's making the same argument. That territory is physically expressed, and it was important to keep that physical expression within the La Quemada Center. So Wells concludes that while interaction among households at the periphery of the site was common, expression of a clear segment of social identity at the core was important in the governance of the polity. Wells suggests that various Mesoamerican microcosms form under dynamic, awful, unstable social conditions. He and de Montmoulin see the creation of a microcosmic center as a viable strategy for centralizing political governance without, quote, obliterating distinctions among social groups, unquote. Okay, we've been dealing with states, and now we're going to look at smaller scale societies and see that this concept still holds sway. Vernon Knight, in his analysis of the Moundville chiefdom in Alabama, uses the concept of a sociogram to suggest that the spatial layout of the site may be a chart or map of important social distinctions. Knight suggests that the, quote, fossilization of sociograms in the construction of centers is partly a political effort to ensure the intergenerational stability of a particular view of social reality, so to perpetuate a particular view of how society is constructed. At Moundville, 15 mounds defined a large central plaza. There are two types of mounds. These are easier to see. So we have large flat-top platform mounds. These are the substructures of elite residences, and they're paired with smaller mounds that were substructures for temples and that are mortuary mounds. So elite are buried in the temple mounds, and elite live on top of the residences on top of the platform mounds. So you get these pairs of elite residence, elite mortuary, elite residence, elite mortuary around the plaza at Moundville. Using a Chickasaw analogy, Knight suggests that each mound represented a corporate group. So among the Chickasaw, when people are organizing around a ceremonial plaza, so this is sort of an ideal diagram of a Chickasaw Center. So this is an ethnographic analogy. You have a central ceremonial plaza. This is a fire pit. And individual clans are organized sequentially around that plaza, and they reproduce the hierarchy of the Chickasaw polity. So the highest ranked clans are on the north side of the plaza, and you decrease in ranking as you go around to the south side. So Knight's argument for the Moundville chiefdom is thus not one of territorial representation, but one of social representation, that different corporate groups are representing themselves at a central place. Now, of the mounds creating the central plaza at Moundville, Mound B, which you see here, is the largest and the most central, and it actually lies outside the alignment of the other mounds. Knight suggests that Mound B supported the residence of the paramount chief at Moundville. And this argument harks back to de Montmoulin's suggestion that the apical plaza complex at Tenam Rosario represents a higher order political entity. So basically, Knight is arguing that you have the same sort of apical construct, this time in a chiefdom, where you have a paramount chief physically expressing their hegemony through the largest mound at the site. Although Knight focuses on the sociality of mound construction at Moundville, both de Montmoulin and Knight appear concerned with the political structure of decision-making in the centers of bounded polities. The authors argue that the physical expression of smaller scale segments of the polity is critical to governance. The concept of microcosm is also relevant to centers constructed by members of less hierarchical societies. So now we're going to the smaller scale societies that we'll be talking about for Hopewell and the Neolithic. Thus far, microcosmic case studies for small-scale societies are available in the ethnographic literature rather than through archaeology. Ethnographically, as with more complex societies, microcosms are ways of expressing social units within communal centers, such that their identity is not subsumed by the whole. Warren de Boer has published on the Chukchi of coastal Ecuador, where dispersed households periodically aggregate in the vacant ceremonial center of Punta Venado. The Chukchi region is divided into 4 territories, and guest houses for members of each territory are arranged around a central plaza using the geographic logic of the larger Chukchi landscape, such that, for example, houses for residents on the downstream territory are located downstream on the plaza. So here you have the stream. So they're representing physically in the center where they're located geographically outside the center. That's how the center is organized. There's a social logic to the construction of these households. Likewise, Tom Dillahay has applied the concept of microcosm to the Mapuche of south central Chile. Their large communal ceremonies bring together members of patrilineages into a ritual community. So what we're seeing here is an idealized diagram. This, sort of like what we saw with the Chickasaw, is a ceremonial ground. It's a rectangular ceremonial space, and people construct, who are coming in from dispersed households out in the rest of the territory of this area, build houses that are placed in relation to where they live in the larger territory. So people who live off here, if this is west, I don't see a north arrow, but if people live to the west, they build their houses to the west. If people live to the north, they build their houses to the north. And interestingly, and it's not, this isn't conveyed by the slide, but the size of the house built around that central plaza is directly related to the size of the lineage, and that's a piece of information I'll come back to as well. Dillahay argues that the active construction of these households in the ceremonial center is considered vital to the sociocultural persistence of lineages. Moreover, individual households and settlements participate in rituals at many different ceremonial fields due to their membership in multiple communities through marriage and trade partnerships. So any individual group will be building houses at multiple ceremonial fields over the course of their lifetime. So to summarize, from state level to small-scale society, the act of constructing a central place and the resulting architectural layout express and reaffirm important socio-political units within the larger society. Such centers are microcosms of sub-territorial political arrangements within a polity, and/or are sociograms involving foundational social units within the society. Moreover, where societies become centralized, the hegemony of a particular socio-political unit is physically expressed in the construction of a larger centralized architectural unit, such as a house, a mound, a pyramid, a plaza. In the next portion of this paper, I apply these insights to an analysis of the segmentary construction of Ohio Hopewell and British Neolithic earthwork enclosures. Now, Bernardini has specifically criticized the territorially focused microcosm model. So Bernardini, who's worked a lot with these Ohio Hopewell earthworks, says the microcosmic model does not work because of the variability in the monuments created and the diversity of activities that took place within them. Moreover, the clustering of dozens of Hopewell earthworks, which I've mentioned before, many of which can be argued to be contemporary, indicates that people were likely involved in the construction of multiple monuments in their lifetime. So there's no village surrogate model that works here. You don't have a community and a single communal place. Thus, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between a community and a ritual center. The concept of sociogram, however, in which social units express their individual presence within a communal ritual place, may aid us in understanding the segmented form of many Ohio Hopewell earthworks and the lack of segmentation of others. As you can see in these charts, people in different drainage systems of southern Ohio created earthworks with different numbers of segments. In the Scioto heartland, so what we've got here are numbers of segments in an individual geometric earthwork, and here we have the number of earthworks, the number of sites in which that number of segment occurs. So what we see with Scioto, the Hopewell heartland, is that either you're creating a unitary feature, so there are no segments, or the modes are between 6 and 8 segments. And that's sort of interesting, because in a comprehensive analysis of mortuary goods from Ohio Hopewell burials, Chris Carr and his students argue for around 9 clans in the Scioto Hopewell area based on the number of different animal species whose power parts, the claws and the teeth, are buried with individuals. That number is similar to the historic Algonquian, whose tribes consisted of about 9 to 11 clans. Thus, I suggest that segment numbers in many Scioto Hopewell earthworks may reflect the number of clans involved in constructing the monument. This scale of participation would fit well with Bernardini's estimate that a few hundred people would be necessary to construct a Scioto earthwork enclosure. The different sizes of segments are interpretable in light of Dillahay's point that the size of construction of Mapuche ceremonial centers is related in part to the size of the lineage. More limited mortuary data from the Miami drainage. So here we have, this is still Hopewell, they're still making enclosures, but the number of segments is tending toward the much smaller end of the scale. And the mortuary data from that drainage did not substantiate an emphasis on clans in the mortuary record. Interestingly, people's construction of earthworks and use of topography in the Miami drainage is markedly different from that of the Scioto Hopewell people. In the Miami drainage, irregular hilltop enclosures are common, so you don't get those nice geometrics, and there are generally fewer segments evident in their construction. This pattern suggests perhaps that fewer social segments, social units, participated in their construction than the Scioto. Maybe here we're dealing with moieties, sodalities, or potentially fewer clans. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is even when we're dealing with earthworks, people may be using and creating earthworks with different social logics in mind. That different social segments may have constructed each earthen segment is evident from excavation data. Excavations of Hopewell embankments have consistently revealed the deliberate selection of certain kinds and colors of earth, and in some cases, certain kinds of stone mantles. These deliberate acts indicate that the earthworks have style, not simply in their finished form, but also in their construction. Like the pastes that potters use to create ceramics, Hopewell craftspeople use different pastes, different combinations of earth and stone, to construct earthworks or portions of earthworks. This variation in the technological style with which earthworks were constructed not only occurs between sites, but within them. Within the work of Hopetoun, which this is a slide from, and I'll elaborate on it in a second, but within the earthwork of Hopetoun, Mark Lynott has documented different combinations of colored earth in different segments of the quadrangle. Okay, so what we're seeing here, this is a plowed field, obviously. The earthwork, in fact, when Squire and Davis went through in the mid to late 1800s, these were one of the earthworks that were 6 to 8 feet tall, and now, you know, you can hardly see them, but you can excavate them. So this earthwork would have gone up like this. They began with yellow clay, and then they accumulated red clay over it. So that's one paste, yellow clay and then red clay. Other areas, and unfortunately I don't have good slides of these, other parts of Hopetoun, they've got yellow clay, red clay, and then black clay. In some parts you've got yellow clay and then stone and then red. So each segment that's been tested in the earthwork has a different technological style of construction. And so that's a piece of information that suggests different groups with different ways of creating an earthwork segment may be coming together to create the whole. There's no counterpart to an apical construction. Okay, so remember those big plazas, those big mounds. There's no counterpart to an apical construction within Hopewell earthwork sites, and thus no particular social unit appears to have achieved a level of hegemony above others. The construction of both segmented and continuous large circles, however, suggests that there may have been context in which the expression of solidarity took precedence over the physical enactment of different social segments. Okay, so what we're looking at in this slide are these large circles. There are about 15 of them in my database. Some of them are segmented, built in segmented fashion, just like everything else. The small circles are never segmented, but they're small. And in other cases, these same circles are unitary, so they're built as a continuous line. The segmentation is not being expressed. Now, unfortunately, chronological data for Ohio Hopewell sites are notoriously sparse, and these sites were used for a long period of time. However, the two unitary circles from sites in a chronological sequence, so these two over here, Old Town and Eastworks, are both parts of sites dated to the latest period of the Hopewell, so dated to about, in the AD 400s. I thus infer that constructing unity in communal ceremonial centers and the reduction of the visibility of segmentary participation may have been becoming important toward the end of the Hopewell ritual practice. Okay, I now segue into a brief comparison between Ohio Hopewell and British Neolithic causewayed enclosures by noting two unique earthworks in the Hopewell region. So we're still in Hopewell. These two earthworks are Fort Ancient and Fort Hill. Both, as we will see with causewayed enclosures, are at the edges of settlement distributions. So the other earthworks were in the middle, these are on the edge. And both were constructed with markedly greater numbers of segments than all other Ohio Hopewell earthworks. Fort Hill is comprised of around 32 segments, and Fort Ancient, which you see here, of around 72. These segments are quite variable in size. So I infer from this dramatically different scale of construction and their location at the boundaries between the Scioto and Miami earthwork systems. So they're between Scioto and Miami. Unfortunately, I don't have a map to illustrate that. That Fort Hill and Fort Ancient represent a different organizational principle, one focused on the participation and perhaps integration of social segments that cross-cut drainages. Further evaluation of this hypothesis will require close comparisons between practices common to these enclosures and those common to smaller scale enclosures in the Scioto and Miami drainages proper. I would, for example, expect a greater diversity of ceramics, ceremonial items, and other material culture in these large enclosures, and evidence of material from both the Scioto and Miami. Okay, turning to the causewayed enclosures, you're going to get sick of this particular slide. Unfortunately, with the causewayed enclosures, many of them have been mined. They're in gravel mining areas, and so you only get little bits of arcs. And so this really is the best illustration I've found of them. Early British Neolithic causewayed enclosures were built at the edges of inhabited areas. Prior has this argued that politically autonomous groups aggregated in these liminal spaces, and there is evidence of long-distance exchange at many of the enclosures, which we don't have at Ohio. Data on the total number of segments are limited for the reason I mentioned. A lot of them have been destroyed. Of those for which I do have data, for the completed ones, the number of segments ranges between 14 and 61, as you see here, with the majority having well more than 20. Thus, the number of segments suggests multiple, large numbers of entities participating in their construction. Segment size, however, suggests a family scale of social unit rather than the lineage or clan that I was arguing for Ohio Hopewell. At Windmill Hill, for example, and this is archaeologists excavating into the ditches that Neolithic people had excavated. At Windmill Hill, for example, the ditches were sunk in 5 to 6 foot diameter pits. Starton has estimated the labor necessary to excavate these segments would have involved teams of around 3 individuals, 2 people excavating and 1 carrying loads. He estimates 1 team could excavate a segment and create the associated embankment in about 12 hours. Even adding another participant, Statton's, he's got people working really hard. So even if you add somebody else in there, very few people would be needed to create a segment, perhaps 1 extended family. These monuments, so the causewayed enclosures, may thus be associated with individual clans whose member families participated in their construction. This would account for their concentration on the landscape and relatively small size in comparison with Ohio Hopewell Earthworks. Clusters of monuments might thus reflect multiple clans. If, however, they are inter-community constructions, family may have been drawn from multiple kin groups. Either scenario fits with the processing of the dead, which is common to many causewayed enclosures. On the one hand, clan members may have come together to honor their ancestors in these places. On the other hand, processing of the dead from multiple communities in a single ceremonial location may be the basis upon which alliances were built. Okay, so you bring people together, and by revering their ancestors together, they create some sort of alliance beyond clans. Chris Carr, in fact, has made this argument for the Ohio Hopewell for the tripartite enclosures in the Scioto drainage. So what he's suggesting is that the tripartite earthworks, so the 3 parts, and the tripart charnel houses, so we've got a room, and another small room, represent alliances of the 3 segments of the Scioto Hopewell area, the Paint Creek, North Fork, and Scioto area itself. So the people bringing their dead, placing the cremations, one part of the valley in one room, another part of the valley in another room, and third part of the valley in the third room, that is a physical and expensive, as one of our ethnographers has said, expensive way of cementing an alliance. To summarize this portion of the paper, the segmentary nature of communal ceremonial monuments is likely to express physically, to fossilize in Knight's term, social relations among different kinds of social segments. These monuments are sociograms. The practice of creating segmented centers has a logic that spans many kinds of smaller scale societies, but the nature of those segments will vary with the kinds of communal relationships intended through the act of construction. The importance of the act of construction itself is underscored by the continuous nature of construction at both at both Ohio Hopewell and British Neolithic sites. Ohio Hopewell peoples continuously constructed new units. So you get one unit built and other units appended. There's this continuous construction over time. British Neolithic peoples reconstructed the same monuments anew by recutting existing ditches. Okay, so we've talked about how the place is created. Now we're going to talk about communal ritual crafting, the crafting of items within these ritual precincts. Communal production for prehistoric ritual was not confined solely to the labor required to construct ceremonial centers. In the remainder of this paper, I briefly discussed the diversity of crafting activities that took place within both geometric earthworks and causewayed enclosures. My intent is to convey a sense of these monuments as loci where multiple kinds of ritual, social, economic, and political networks intersected. The social logic behind monument creation was not necessarily the social logic through which people organized activities within these monuments. I first addressed ritual production in the prehistoric Ohio and British records, and then move on to ethnographic data to explore the kinds of social relations by which such production is likely to have been organized. Three modes characterize the crafting of esoteric items in the ritual precincts of the Ohio Hopewell. Crafting as a route to power, crafting for more generalized participation in communal ritual, and crafting to gear up for communal ceremonies, to amass a large quantity of food and goods so that you can host guests who are coming in from elsewhere. The second of these modes is also prominent in British Neolithic causewayed enclosures. As the term mode indicates, these are not hard categories, but as much as tendencies toward certain kinds of practice. Crafting aimed at achieving powerful positions is epitomized by the power questing evident in the long, dangerous journey that relatively few Ohio Hopewell individuals made to Yellowstone. These journeys are attested to by the acquisition of obsidian and grizzly bear canines. Okay, so what we've got, basically, Ohio Hopewell crafters drew on a wide variety of exotic raw materials, but the vast majority of those raw materials are found in the eastern woodlands and had been circulating and been being used since the Archaic, so for thousands of years. But with Ohio Hopewell, you have a few individuals who are coming out of the Ohio River. They're coming up the Mississippi and then up the Missouri, and ultimately, I'm losing myself here, but ultimately down the Yellowstone and into the Yellowstone Basin, which, if any of you have been there, is really the most remarkable place in North America, a very charged, very powerful place, and particularly so if there are no RVs and tourist stands and stuff like that around there. So their destination was this very powerful place. This is what power questing is all about. You go to a powerful place to acquire that, at least some aspect of that power, but you have to prove that you made the journey, and you want to bring back pieces of that place. And that's what the obsidian and the grizzly bear canines represent. And the obsidian has been sourced to Yellowstone. So these bifaces come from Hopewell sites, and some of them are enormous. These grizzly bear canines come from Hopewell sites. Raw obsidian was brought back to Ohio and then skillfully crafted into large, impressive bifaces. Vast quantities of debitage under a mound at the Hopewell site attest to the fact that the bifaces were created after the trip had been completed, a rather risky endeavor given the distance to the source should an error be made. So these power questers who went to Yellowstone had a great deal of chutzpah. They didn't make them there. They brought the raw material back and fashioned these quite large bifaces at home. This journey took people well outside the world of the eastern woodlands, and fighting a grizzly bear for its teeth suggests a degree of bravery beyond that of ordinary mortals. The other aspect of the grizzly bears is that they drilled the canines. Ohio Hopewell people drilled the canines again once they got back. They would put pearls and other sorts of things in there. It's very easy for those canines to split, and then once again, you've made the journey, you've dealt with the grizzly bear, but you take that risk to drill them for suspension and to embellish them with pearls. Thus, it's not surprising that the obsidian bifaces are highly concentrated at the Hopewell site itself. This is the site of the most abundant socially valued goods within all of Ohio Hopewell, and Carr has identified the Hopewell site as a mortuary site for the highest status leaders in the Scioto area. Beyond obsidian, there are other raw materials such as copper, which would have required a difficult journey, but a shorter one, and a journey that had been made for millennia. So copper is immensely abundant in Ohio Hopewell sites. Copper is coming from the Great Lakes, from Lake Superior area, Keweenaw Peninsula, and also Isle Royal. That's a difficult journey. It's not easy. It's somewhat distant, but people had been mining copper up there again since the Archaic. So it's a known piece of the landscape, even though it's not immediately within the Hopewell sphere. It is this journey that I categorize as one that many more individuals engaged in to create objects necessary for participation in ceremonial events. Such objects include copper ear spools and breastplates. So there is an abundance of ear spools. Not everybody would have had them, but a large number, lesser abundance, but still quite a number of copper breastplates that were then made back in these ritual precincts in Ohio. Okay, so we're dealing with the personal gaining of things to be an adult, to participate as a regular person in large-scale communal ceremonies. And with the British Neolithic, we have a similar kind of items, similar kinds of journeys evident in stone axes, which are the quintessential symbol of the Neolithic. Flint and igneous rock from which the axes were made were roughed out at quarries and then ground and polished into axes. Igneous rock was quarried from distant and hard-to-reach exposures, so this is a source of some of the axe stone, picosicle, up in Cumbria in northern England. And they didn't settle for the perfectly suitable axe stone that was available along the slopes of the pike. They worked their way around the side into very difficult-to-reach areas and mine the stone there, and we have evidence of quarrying from this place. In terms of the Neolithic, in terms of the flint, there's a lot of really good flint available simply on the surface of the ground around England, southern England. But instead of picking that up, they create these huge flint mines. This is just a pockmarked landscape that represents the remains of deep shafts that were then expanded outward. So you dig deeply into the ground, expand laterally, as this picture shows you here. This is a Neolithic flint mine in the Norfolk area, Grimes Graves. So tremendous amount of effort that was actually unnecessary for procuring the flint, as high-quality flint was readily available on the surface or through excavation of shallow pits. This focus on depth suggests that the difficulty and danger of acquisition were important components of acquiring the raw materials. At causewayed enclosures, the finishing of groundstone axes is evident. While axes were completed at other places, causewayed enclosures are a prominent locus, as evidenced by the recovery of polishing stones. So you sort of rough out the axe at the quarry, and then it takes a great deal of time to take an abrasive stone like sandstone and work down and polish these axes into their final form. Several enclosures have relatively large numbers of axes, representing a diversity of sources. So people are bringing in and exchanging axes from all over England and some from portions of France. Unlike Ohio Hopewell craft items, which do not circulate beyond the Earthwork precinct, axes circulated widely across the Neolithic landscape. Ohio Hopewell ritual objects appear to have been crafted for use only in ceremonial centers, while Neolithic axes were important in multiple ritual, social, and economic realms. Now, larger scale gearing up, that third category, gearing up for communal ceremony is evident in some Ohio Hopewell ritual items such as mica and copper cutouts. The manufacture of many cutouts, and often they're circles and triangles. The things that people take pictures of are the fancy ones, but a lot of them are quite simple. And I should point out that they're sewn onto garments, and so you get these little holes. Can't see, I think there are two holes right here. So what they're doing is creating sheets of mica or sliding sheets of mica off or creating sheets of copper, and then using a template to cut out many simple geometric shapes and then some of these more complex ones that you see here. The manufacture of many of the simple cutouts required little skill and could have been carried out by anyone with access to the raw material, a flint blade, and a template. Of the exotic raw materials acquired by Ohio Hopewell peoples, mica is the only one to have been found with some regularity in residential sites, as well as the earthworks. So some of this gearing up is happening at home, although the majority seems to happen at the earthwork sites. The Ohio Hopewell record of the personal social valuables and the simpler ornaments indicates that large numbers of these items were probably crafted for individual events. The scale of production for ritual action mirrors the gearing up that is common in the ethnographic record of ceremonial preparation in small-scale societies. Unfortunately, neither the Neolithic nor the Ohio Hopewell records are very helpful in discerning how such gearing up was organized. In the last part of this paper, I thus turn to ethnographic data from small-scale societies to understand the sociality of gearing up. Once constructed, how might people in small-scale societies have organized the productive activities that occurred within these ceremonial centers? Given that mortuary ceremonialism is present in both of the archaeological cases, I focused on ethnographic data concerning communal mortuary ceremony, which provides parallel and contrasting scenarios with the archaeological records just presented. Gearing up for communal rituals is a several-month-long process. This is a tremendous investment of time and labor, which includes both exchange for and the production of items for use in ritual or to be given away at mortuary ceremonies. This gearing up is common throughout the ethnographic records of mortuary ritual in smaller-scale societies, from the eastern woodlands to California to New Guinea to Melanesia. Most salient for the purposes of this paper is that the vast majority of preparation for communal ceremony does not take place in the ceremonial precinct. We're dealing in most cases with societies that live in villages. You can gear up, you can store, you can prepare in the context of your household. It's not the same settlement pattern that we see with the Neolithic or Ohio Hopewell. So, for example, in the Trobrians, preparation for a women's mourning ceremony, matrilineal kinswomen of the deceased spend 4 to 8 months in their villages creating banana leaf bundles and banana leaf skirts, thousands of which may be given away in ceremony. Production in ritual context does occur, however, in sort of 3 kinds of situations. One, where ritual practitioners are the primary users of the crafted items. So they're taking ritual knowledge, they're taking the power of the ritual place, they're creating items that they themselves use. The second case is when sacred items must be viewed only by certain members of a community, such as initiates, so you want to keep them secreted from, but visually separate from the rest of the community. And the third case is more an efficiency sort of context, when the item to be crafted is bulky, more efficiently crafted where it will be used. And so let me just briefly give you an example of each of these situations. Pueblo prayer stick and mass production are examples of the first context. Among many Pueblos, ritual practitioners make prayer sticks and kivas, which are ceremonial structures. The emphasis on production of prayer sticks in this ceremonial context reflects the fact that it is the ritual practitioners who are the greatest users of prayer sticks. The second context, that of restricting view, is illustrated by ritual crafting in Arnhem Land in Australia, where men create bark paintings at ceremonial grounds, sometimes in shelters specifically erected for that purpose, because the paintings are only allowed to be seen by initiates. The paintings are then curated in special structures in those ceremonial precincts. And then finally, the carving and decoration of wooden poles for graves among Tiwi and tribes in Arnhem Land conforms to the third context, being a short-term activity involving heavy, bulky materials. Among the Tiwi, and there's an interesting comparison here, there's a more historical situation where the number of poles and the elaborateness and the size of them reflects the status of the deceased, the wealth of the deceased family. And then here you have more of a Christian burial with the poles situated, sort of structured in a very different way around the grave. But anyway, among the Tiwi, the poles created to mark the deceased grave may be up to 3 feet in diameter and 20 feet tall. Pole carving is carried out by individuals, but they work together as a group, and they have an informal leader. Carvers vary in their skill at pole carving, and it's possible to achieve prestige for skill and to be sort of recruited to be a pole carver. Up to a dozen carvers may be commissioned. The wealth of the deceased relatives, as I mentioned, determines the number of workers who can be paid and the elaboration of the poles. Ethnographic data on preparations for communal rituals indicate that a different social ethic underwrites the production of ritual objects than ritual places. As discussed above, communal participation of different social segments occurs in the construction of place. In the production of mortuary objects, the social status of individuals in relation to the deceased is the primary factor in determining who crafts. In some situations, the appropriate people are close kin of the deceased, as in the case of the Trobrians and those banana bundles. kinswomen of the deceased father and kinswomen of the deceased spouse are the appropriate people to craft those, and 40 to 70 women will come together and congregate for the weaving. In other cases where the grave is being constructed, it is those less close to the deceased who are appropriate to carry out the crafting. Examples include the tiwi and these pole carvers, where the people creating the elaborately carved posts that mark an individual's grave are unrelated to the deceased. These craft persons must have rights to the raw materials that they're making the poles out of, however. Pole carvers are ritually commissioned by the patriline of the deceased, and this sort of complementarity we see in other contexts. So, for example, among California hunter-gatherers, tribes are complementary to one another in terms of mortuary preparation. Crafting in ritual precincts thus draws on many kinds of social statuses. On the one hand, aspiring leaders or aggrandizers may control certain kinds of crafting through their skill and or sacred knowledge. On the other hand, given that gearing up for mourning rituals often draws upon complementary relations between kin and non-kin of the deceased, every individual will be in a worker position several times in his or her lifetime. Thus most, if not all, people craft. So in conclusion, the focus of this paper has been on the agency, the nature of agency in ceremonial production within small-scale societies. Thus far, much of the literature on agency in archaeology has been concerned with individuals' aspirations for power and influence, their aggrandizers, or with gender, particularly the diverse agencies of women. Both foci are important, and as I discussed above, some aspects of the Ohio Hopewell record clearly indicate power questing on the part of some individuals. Between aspiring leaders and entire genders, however, there is an enormous diversity of social groups who also have agency, who have stakes in the outcome of communal actions, as well as ceremonial obligations to one another. These groups are generally considered the structure through which individual actions are channeled. I suggest, however, that there is a great deal of dynamism that is lost in categorizing social units as structure. You can put a lot of adjectives up against structure, but essentially that's a very inert concept, particularly in prehistory when action at this scale, at the social group scale, is far more visible than our individual actions. Finally, I find it useful to think of constructed ceremonial places as institutions in Michael Mann's terms, that involve the intersection of a number of different ritual, economic, social, and political networks. The scenario that I have provided here is that Ohio Hopewell earthworks were sociograms constructed by corporate groups whose identity was important to materialize in the context of communal ceremonial places. Perhaps the very development of communal ritual beyond the corporate group was threatening enough in some way that buy-in of such groups required the visible expression of parts of the new whole. I have suggested that Ohio Hopewell's social reality began to change after a few centuries, and that such that materialization of unity rather than partition began to be important. In the British Neolithic, smaller scale social units, possibly extended families, appear to have had a stake in communal action of some unknown scale. Causewayed enclosures could have been the communal creation of large corporate groups such as clans. Alternatively, people forming alliances that cut across territories who came together for feasting, exchange, mortuary-related activities may have been responsible for these constructions. Activities within both kinds of enclosure were the result of multiple individual actions with different kinds of social networks, from gender to complementary ritual obligations to trade partnerships, individual competition for prestige. The richness and complexity of these records will challenge us for many decades to come. Thank you. So that's a lot of talking, some slides. I'm happy to answer questions if there are issues you'd like fleshed out or clarified.
I might ask, you talked about the Yellowstone Obsidian, and you talked about power questing, suggesting that Hopewell individuals traveled from Ohio to secure that obsidian. Is there evidence for that?
So the question is whether there's evidence of physically Ohio people going to Yellowstone, and the evidence comes in terms of a lack of fall off. So we don't have it in Yellowstone. There hasn't been found Hopewell artifacts, for example, to say, oh, how Hopewell people made it here. But the obsidian is in Yellowstone, and then the obsidian is in southern Ohio. And at the time that they're receiving it, people in between are not using it to hardly any degree at all. So it really seems to be going out and getting a large quantity rather than down the line. You don't have that fall off in the distribution. And it sort of fits. I have a publication now about power questing. It fits that kind of ethic that you go to a powerful place on the landscape, and a few individuals seem to have upped the ante, in terms of Yellowstone. It's also likely just to elaborate a little bit, Yellowstone being the kind of place it is, it likely was known in some capacity across North America, the existence of a geyser, paint pot sort of place. But journeying to it would have been fairly daunting. Sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
It seems like those segments of both the European and Hopewellian earthworks also create openings in between the segments.
Right.
What do you think was the function of those openings?
Well, there are two ways of thinking about it. So on the one hand, the function of the openings is simply the end of the segment. So in order to create a segment, you've got to sort of stop it. In some cases, there are people who have looked at astronomical alignments, and some of them are astronomically aligned, but not all of them. So particularly there are a lot of things going on with Hopewell, but the particularly astronomically constructed ones, I don't know if you notice that the squares are very, very regular. And those in particular the segments are equal length, and they have openings in exactly the same places. Those are the ones that seem in particular to have astronomical alignments. And then some really, the axes. So this axis in Newark here is a solstice alignment. Yeah.
I was intrigued by your discussion about who should craft grave goods and who should make mortuary places.
Mm-hmm.
And from ethnography, it seems very much that this question about, should it be strangers or should it be kin, quite often reflects ideas of pollution.
Right.
As to practices of, double burial, which you also mentioned in the Avery example.
Right.
Is there anything that could lead you to ask whether, these questions of pollution or not are here, there, and the polluted body and things like that?
There's nothing that I'm. Oh, okay. Sorry. So the question has to do with the fact that when you have situations of non-kin responsible for dealing with the mortuary preparations, particularly associated with the grave, but often other things, for their partners. So non-kin doing it for other non-kin. Anyway, the reason you don't have kin burying their own dead is because of concerns about pollution being associated with the body, being associated potentially with the spirit or whatever. And so how do we grapple with this in the archaeological record? And my answer is that there's nothing that I know of concrete enough in the archaeological record to allow us to say. So we can look at a pattern in the ethnographic record, which is a lot of what I've been talking about, and say, that kind of pattern fits, is congruent with what we see in the archaeological record, but it's very hard to go the other way, to say, boy, here's something in the archaeological record and it's about pollution. That's a tougher thing. We have occasionally, the only other, or another context in which you think about pollution in some societies has to do with menstruation, and we do have evidences of what we think are probably minstrel huts, say in the Southwest. So looking for particular kinds of structures may give us a sense of whether pollution is part of the dialogue or part of how you structure practice.